Fact sheets on this project were pretty interesting. They were put together predominantly for the local community of Kona, which is very small, and we're talking a few hundred people that live there. But obviously they were all very concerned about what the military might be bringing to their part of the woods. In terms of that technology, what they said that this was all about was, first of all, the military said it's strictly a research project with maybe a little bit of a spin-off in terms of communications technology. And what they were speaking about, and what they spoke about in those fact sheets early on, were the idea of a system for creating what's called an extremely low frequency, an ELF, for communicating with submarines. Now, the way this used to be done, in Wisconsin, Michigan area of the United States, they have very large antennas buried under the ground. These antennas run 14 to 28 miles long apiece. And they create a very long wave, a signal, that then penetrates the earth, penetrates the ocean, and signals submarines. What this technology does is much, much different. In fact, it takes it to a much higher state of technology and capability. What it does is it takes this technology, it takes the signal from this ionosphere heater, from this HAARP transmitter. It causes the ionosphere, way above the Earth, to begin to oscillate, to pulse, at a frequency that creates back to the Earth an ELF, an extremely low frequency. This frequency then goes to the Earth, to the ocean, and communicates with submarines. So in effect, what they do is they change the ionosphere from just a natural shield to part of, a mechanical part of a weapon system. It's that same application that's used for Earth-penetrating tomography, the idea of looking into the Earth to see what's under the ground. Now, one of the other applications of Earth-penetrating tomography beyond just locating underground nuclear facilities would also be for distinguishing between mineral stratas, such as oil and gas fields, ore bodies of various kinds, because that strata has a different signature or characteristic. What the military has said is, even though that energy is coming back to the Earth, it's not something we need to worry about, because the amount of energy involved is approximately the same as the amount of energy which naturally occurs in the Earth in any case. The problem with that is it doesn't line up with the research. And we're going to talk about the frequency ranges of Earth-penetrating tomography as well as the physiological effects of that application as we go on through the presentation today. One of the other issues that is raised by military is the idea, in fact it was raised first by Bernard Eastman in his patent, of creating electromagnetic pulses in the upper atmosphere. Now, what is an electromagnetic pulse? An EMP as such. It's a pulse of energy that causes electronic circuits to basically not work, to go haywire, for computers to fail. The way these used to be created was with a thermonuclear detonation in the upper atmosphere, which would create an energy pulse covering a very large area below, knocking out electronics. With a HAARP transmitter, you can artificially create the same electromagnetic pulse over the same large area, but without radioactive radiation as a byproduct. So it becomes a much more advanced technology. One of the other possibilities with this technology, and one the military acknowledges, is the idea of blowing holes in the ionosphere, the idea of opening up a space in this natural shield that then lets all of those incoming energy streams in our immediate environment. While it might have some interesting weapons effects possibilities, it also has the possibility of having profound effects on human beings. This can be compared, blowing holes in the ionosphere, to creating holes in the ozone layer, except with much, much different consequences. When you're talking about blowing holes in the ionosphere, you're really talking about something that would make ozone layer depletion pale. You know, ozone protects us from ultraviolet radiation, which can cause some forms of skin cancer and can cause some forms of severe sunburn. And it's an area that, you know, certainly everybody's been concerned with around the planet. But when you're talking about the ozone layer and you're talking about the ionosphere, you're talking about something much, much different. The kinds of radiations that enter the system through a hole in the ionosphere are much, much more damaging. In fact, so damaging that they could alter the genetic blueprint on the planet if left open and exposed for any great length of time. The military says not to worry. John Heckscher says not worry. The holes will fill back in relatively quickly, within minutes. But you know, something that the research shows and we cite in our book is that the holes in the ozone, for instance, when they have disclosed to everyone how horrible it is to use aerosol cans and so forth, what they fail to mention, and the scientific research shows, and it was first discovered with the launch of Skylab. Skylab created a huge hole in the ozone layer. In fact, every time we launch a rocket or a missile or a space shuttle through that layer, we create a hole or a depletion in ozone. Yeah, and they used to say then, don't worry, within a few hours, everything sort of comes back together. It's still depleted, it just comes back together, and the overall density of the ozone layer is depleted. It takes millions and millions of cans of aerosol to amount to one space shuttle launch, yet you don't hear them talking about curtailing those. What you're talking about with the ionosphere is, of course, much more important, and the question becomes, do we trust them with that basic premise that it'll fill back in shortly after they turn the device off. The issue of this kind of technology in terms of military trust is also an issue that we explore within the text of the book. And something I want to say, at this point, for many of you who have not seen the book, it is well footnoted. There's 350 sources cited within the text, and those sources are easily obtained. So the things we're speaking about here today aren't just coming from us. It's really the military's words, the government's words, and what we're doing is characterizing it in a way that makes it readily and easily understood. When you talk about some of the other applications, potential applications, and you talk about these kinds of ionospheric instruments, some people have asked, and it's come to mind, that the woodpecker signal, which originated out of the former Soviet Union in the early 70s. This signal was picked up first by ham operators that were picking up a buzzing, clicking sound, hence the name woodpecker. It's interesting to note those same transmitters that the military talks about in terms of HAARP technology when comparing HAARP to others around the world happens to be those same transmitters associated with the woodpecker signal. What's interesting about that is the woodpecker signal in the early 70s had a number of things attributed to it that were quite interesting. One of those items was the idea that it was creating anomalous or unusual phenomena in the atmosphere. Some asserted that it actually created weather modification, weather changes, and some even asserted that it had profound physiological effects and mental effects on people in Eugene, Oregon. What happened out of that was a number of people raised objections. The signal was curtailed sometime in the latter 70s, and what's also interesting about that is when they curtailed the signal was around the same time that the United States signed off on weather modification agreements. Weather modification is one of the areas that HAARP transmitters could be utilized in a very effective way from that perspective. And this is an area when we first spoke about it and first introduced people to this whole idea of weather modification using manipulated signals from a radio transmitter, the first thing people's eyes glaze over and they look at us strangely. But the fact of the matter was, in 1977, in December of 1977, the United States with over 60 other countries signed an agreement, an international agreement forbidding the use of weather modification as a weapon of war. In other words, over 20 years ago, the technology had advanced sufficiently to cause international concerns, the kinds of concerns that led to agreements to curtail its development and use at a time when we hadn't even signed off many of our nuclear arms agreements and many of our chemical weapons agreements. And yet, the state of that technology became of such great concern that the international community decided to cut off the use of that technology. What's interesting is in that agreement there are exemptions. The exemptions are for domestic use, or use that doesn't migrate across national boundaries. Why that's interesting is in the course of HAARP technology, the whole idea of weather modification was breached by a number of folks out in the rural parts of Alaska who, when they looked at this technology, were raising those kinds of questions. Could this be used for weather modification? Now, where they raised that objection and where they raised that question was with the Spectrum Planning Committee, which is a subdivision of the United States Department of Commerce. In presenting their objections in formal form, the way that Spectrum Planning Committee responded was a little bit unusual. What you would have expected had it not been used in that particular way